What makes you happy?
Be yourself, be positive. Just another mindset.
Hello, friends, and welcome to a new episode of the Just Another Mindset podcast, the show that inspires you to change and live a more exciting life. My name is Ishmael, and each week I bring to you a relevant conversation, message, or topic that will not only entertain you, but help you to change towards a more meaningful and satisfying life, individually and collectively. Let us get inspired and embrace collective changes for the better. For today's episode, I had the great joy and opportunity to talk to Dr. Tracy Dennis-Tiwary, who is a professor in psychology and neuroscience. She's also the director of the Emotion Regulation Lab and co-executive director of the Center of Health Technology at Hunter College. Her mission there is to connect researchers, community stakeholders, and technology innovators to bridge the healthcare gap. In this episode, we discuss the difference of fear and anxiety, and why the latter is in fact a triumph of human evolution. You will learn what happens in your brain if you get anxious, and you will learn some things about the history of anxiety you don't know yet. We talk about benefits and limitations of the medical disease model and how our mindset is key for so many things. We cannot eradicate anxiety, and really, we don't want to. You will learn how to invite anxiety into your life by turning it around and using it for your benefit. The only way out of anxiety is through it, and we discuss how anxiety can create hope. We discuss ways to find purpose and what we have to teach our children about technology. And finally, you will hear about the greatest superpowers of humans and how to use them for society. And with that, Tracy, a warm welcome to the Just Another Mindset podcast. And the first question I have for you is, how do you feel and what is on your mind?
Lovely. I'm feeling quite good, a little tired, but that's okay. And looking forward, I was thinking about it as I was getting ready this morning, looking forward to a nice in-depth conversation. I think conversation is one of the things that it's probably the reason I do what I do in terms of being a researcher and a psychologist and a writer. And so looking forward to that. And on my mind, I was thinking a lot about, I wrote a book about anxiety, which I'm sure we'll be talking about, but really I was thinking this morning about the larger, mental health. How much is it valuable to really pull back and think through the larger mental health industry, especially in the US, but I think about around the world. And so I was, believe it or not, as I was brushing my teeth, I was thinking about, we're doing mental health wrong. And I'm looking forward to talking to Ismail about how we are doing mental health, pursuing mental health in some ways that actually probably hinder us more than help. And so that's where I am right now.
Wonderful. And I think that's especially important as we see that the mental health industry, I'm just gonna call it for the sake of ease, is growing so fast, right? So if you say we do some things wrong, or at least we could do a few things better, I think it's good to have such conversations and to talk about what could be done maybe a little bit more, or if there's different viewpoints for certain things. And that nicely leads us already to, yes, that's the book that you published, I believe, 2.5 months ago. And that is one of the reasons why we are here today. And it reads, The Future Tense, Why Anxiety is Good for You, Even Though It Feels Bad. And Tracy, the first question that came to mind for myself is, what is anxiety and how does it differ from fear? Maybe we start there.
That's a great question to start with, because I think one of the misunderstandings that we have about anxiety is that we do equate it with fear. And that's natural because it feels very similar, right? So it's that, we think of fear and anxiety as involving fight and flight, and freezing, the three Fs. We know in our body what it often feels like. It's the racing heart. It's our autonomic nervous system getting into high gear. The thoughts start to, we know what it feels like in our minds when the thoughts start to swirl, and really both feel pretty bad. So, but the interesting thing about fear and anxiety is, although they look and feel very similar, they're profoundly different. And it's really that difference is what caused me to entitle the book Future Tense, because while fear is that reaction of fight, flight, and freezing in response to a present certain danger or threat. It's, a saber-toothed tiger is jumping at you. If you're a prehistoric person, you're going down a dark alley and there's a mugger who's approaching you. That is fear, and it prepares you to respond adaptively. But anxiety has nothing to do with that present certainty of danger. Anxiety is all about the future. It's apprehension, specifically about the uncertain future, which all future is, of course, uncertain. And that apprehension about the uncertain future, it prepares us to react and plan if something bad might happen, but that bad thing has not happened yet. So anxiety has this unique ability to also prepare us for those good things that could happen. And it prepares us to work harder and persist and hope to make the positive outcomes into reality. So fear is all about present and certain danger, but anxiety, the flip side of it, is really hope for the future.
So it's necessarily linked to certainty and uncertainty, I hear. So fear is linked to a certain danger reoccurring in this very moment. And anxiety is really in the future for an uncertainty. I don't know if you can talk to uncertainty a little bit and what we understand about it.
Well, that's right. And every second in front of us is uncertain. So I could be speaking with you now, and I think this is just going to be a podcast conversation, but, something could crash through my window in 2 seconds. So every moment ahead of us is uncertain existentially. And what anxiety evolved to do was to prepare us to handle that fundamental nature of being human, of being a living being, honestly. And so uncertainty, we are sort of like uncertainty, radars. We immediately detect uncertainty. Our brains are very good and efficient at identifying uncertainty, and the uncertainty. Oh, see, I told you I couldn't predict what would happen. The dog came. Honey, it's really important that you take him downstairs. My son woke up.
Talking about uncertainty, perfect fit, I would say.
He was wondering where is mom? So illustration.
Wonderful.
So I heard. So let me play this out. So I heard the dog's little, his little collar. He has a little a tag on him, and as I heard that, I was like, oh no, I'm not sure what's happening. But I'm pretty sure that dog is coming up here and is going to start barking. So let me just let my son take the dog down.
Absolutely.
That's okay. Boo. I'll see you later, honey. Close the door, please. So uncertainty requires what is actually a triumph of human evolution, which is the ability to imagine what hasn't happened yet. It's our prefrontal cortex, really. They are simulation machines. Where we can exquisitely, picture, imagine, and plan for something that hasn't even happened yet, something that has never existed before. So that simulation of the future is also why we aren't still living in caves, if you think about it. If we didn't have this ability to simulate and prepare for the future, if we didn't have anxiety that emotionally activated us to move into that future, I think we would never have built civilizations. So from that perspective, the challenge of uncertainty, yes, anxiety feels bad, but it's this space between where we are now and where we want to be that's uncomfortable. That's where we inhabit when we're anxious and when we're thinking and planning for the future.
Understood. And if you call it a triumph of human evolution, is that necessarily then correlated with the fact that there is no other animal that actually feels this anxiety and can predict the future, so that we say we are very unique in a way to be able to do such as humans?
I think now this would be contentious, and I'm usually cheerfully controversial. So it would be an interesting discussion to have, especially with animal behavioral researchers, of which I have many colleagues who do wonderful work in this area. So one can imagine, and actually that, my dog, who wants to be with me all the time and tends to bark when something alarms him, he is kind of an anxious dog. Now it's perfect, right? Because I just wrote a book about anxiety and I have the most anxious dog on the planet and I can't seem to do much about it. No progress whatsoever. But his anxiety, yes, it's about something that hasn't happened yet. It's a nervousness. It's a fear about, oh, well, he was a rescue, so he fears separation from his pack, and that's there. But the question becomes, can he really imagine the future possibilities in the same way as a human? Biologically, the best evidence suggests not. So when we study these emotions in animals, which is very valuable to do, I think we should be very careful before we upward extend it to human experiences, to understand that we're probably getting at a lot of fear, and we're getting at a different class of anxiety that does not have within it this incredible simulation capacity that we humans have, this ability to imagine and verbally mediate and do all those things that an animal like a dog can't do necessarily.
But maybe not. So animals may as well feel anxiety and feel anxious, but they don't really have the ability to turn it around to use it for their own good, is what I hear from that. And
it's certainly to the degree that humans can do.
Absolutely. And Tracy, what I found super interesting is that you were a professor of psychology and neuroscience. And I'm super interested in, what does anxiety do to the human brain? What is happening in the brain once we get anxious?
So much is happening. And of course, a lot of times when we think about brain science, it's we picture it as sort of modern day phrenology. Phrenology was that old kind of pseudoscience where you read the bumps on the head and, oh, there's a spot for love, there's a spot for anger. And anxiety and all of our functions don't work that way. Anxiety recruits many crucial circuits in our brains when we're anxious. It does include and activate the threat detection and response system. These kind of circuitries that integrate the subcortical, limbic, more affective, emotional, motivational parts of our brain. And these circuits connect it with our prefrontal cortex, which is the more deliberative, regulatory, inhibitory parts of our brain. So anxiety triggers that system where we have a reaction and we need to do something with it. It also, though, does a bunch of things that we don't typically understand it to do, because we've never asked the question. We've assumed it's just like fear. One thing that anxiety does is increases levels of the neurotransmitter dopamine in the brain. Now, dopamine is the feel-good hormone. We associate it with sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It kind of gets this bad. We also associate with social media, problematic social media use. It's this sort of addiction, But really, what dopamine is it has functions far beyond that. Like all neurotransmitters in the brain, it's a sort of shuttlecock. It's there to communicate and integrate areas of the brain and sending signals from one area to the other. So what dopamine really does is it helps us efficiently marshal our brain resources to pursue our desired goals, to get the things we want in life, to get beautiful things and great things and positive, rewarding things. So anxiety increases that circulating dopamine in the brain. So in that sense, it prepares us to channel that anxiety and that energy and that focus to make those future outcomes that we want into reality. It also does something incredible in terms of one of our greatest sources of support and ways that we can manage mental health challenges, which is that it primes us to seek social support by increasing levels of the social bonding hormone oxytocin in the brain. So oxytocin increases when you see it increase in the mother-child bonding. When a mother gives birth, oxytocin goes through the roof, when she's nursing, but also in romantic relationships. But it's not just there when we have a relationship. It actually activates us to connect to enriching, supportive relationships. And we as humans are social animals. So we evolved very early on to understand that if we're not connected to a tribe that's there and has our back, we will perish. So this human motivation to connect to others and to outsource our physical and emotional needs to the tribe, to the connected community. Anxiety helps us, it primes us to do that. So these are ways that anxiety is so much more complex than we give it credit for.
And how come we don't give it as much credit? Is it because we haven't asked the right questions for some time? Or since when do we distinguish between fear, anxiety, and study both of them individually, and maybe also the benefits of anxiety? Or how many people are there who have a similar stand to yours, that anxiety in fact is something very well for humans and for our brains and for our behavior?
Yeah, I think that the story is, it goes way back, and then there's a more modern story as well. But the way back story is that, and I'll really only talk about the West, and I think I could write a whole book about Eastern and other views about emotion. But there were some very specific things that happened in medieval Europe that set the stage for where we are now with anxiety. One of those things is that as the Catholic Church gained centrality in people's lives, anxiety went from being a word that wasn't really used very much in the common language to actually being used to describe this new internal life that the Catholic Church had started to teach people about, the life of the soul. And so now anxiety, rather than being, it comes from these early words for choking, these Indo-European words like ang, which means to choke. And it was always and when it was used in common language and across Europe, it was really to describe that choking feeling, like the uncomfortable constriction you feel sometimes when you're anxious. But the Catholic Church turned it into a state of the soul, that you have anxiety as you're anticipating the potential that you will be burning in hellfire for all eternity. And Burton, who wrote one of the first, it was really like late medieval, early Renaissance, this first sort of psychiatric manual. He was arguably one of the first psychiatrists. He was talking about all sorts of health problems, but he talked about anxiety. He talked about melancholy. It was called The Anatomy of Melancholy. He talked about psychology as being, though, both spiritual and internal. So he called anxiety the foul fiend of fear. So he was also mixing up anxiety with fear like that. So there are these early like danger that was infused into this notion of anxiety. And then you have the scientific revolution, you have the Enlightenment, you have these other forces in which philosophical and scientific ideas that separated the soul from the body and the mind and was contending with all those differences. Where anxiety lived was in this place of irrationality. So that now, and even before that, in early, ancient Roman thought and Greek thought, there's this idea that anger, difficult emotions are a short madness. So Horace wrote, anger is a short madness. And so you have this idea that uncomfortable, painful emotions, they're dangerous, there's something wrong, and they may even be illness. Then we have the modern psychology and psychiatry emerge, starting with Freud and others. And anxiety became central to how we think about psychological pathology. And so now, and of course, with Freud and with neuroses and with, all of these concepts that were Freudian, and then even with the more cognitive and behavioral and scientific approaches, anxiety was right in the middle of the things that could go wrong with a human being. And we shifted to a medical model of our internal life. So that means if you have a disease, it's this infectious disease approach, really, the medical model, which is to say, if you have a disease, there's an infection or a virus or a organ is breaking down or a cancer. And so the solution to a medical disease is that you eradicate the disease. So now we're in this field. Now fast forward to where we are in psychology now. We have the disease model, the medical model gave us wonderful science. We have wonderful treatments that seem to work when we do the randomized control trials. But why is it, especially in the US, but I think all over the world, the rate of mental health disorders are only on the rise? So we have not, our scientific advances in psychology and psychiatry have not kept pace with the medical sciences, the other medical sciences. And Tom Insel, who was the head of the National Institute of Mental Health, one of our major funding agencies in the United States, said just 3 or 4 weeks ago, he's left the NIMH since, but he said just a few weeks ago this is the guy who ran the show, and really promulgated the medical model of mental illness. He said, the infectious disease, the disease model of mental illness does not work. Full stop. Why? Because treating difficult emotions, difficult experiences, trauma as something to eradicate is not the right template for really advancing the goal of human well-being. So we are in a very challenging spot right now with the mental health industry. As a Gen Xer, I like to call it the mental health industrial complex, and get a little more, honestly, a little more punk rock about it, because in all honesty, what we're doing now is not working, and we need to do things differently. And I wrote the book as a way of saying mental health, how we're doing it, isn't working, and anxiety is a prime case study. And so that's where that's where I'm hoping we can start this much broader conversation.
And you call it a big challenge, which I certainly do agree to, but it's also a big opportunity, right? It depends on how you would frame it in the end. And if there is this big opportunity that we get a better understanding, or a different understanding, if you may call it, about anxiety, that we can actually use that as a case study and use that as one of the examples where we can maybe, get a different understanding for society and how to deal with certain abilities or certain diseases. I don't even know what I want to call it, but that we handle experiences differently. And that maybe leads me also to another follow-up question that just came to mind. And that is, what is the difference, Tracy, between anxiety and an anxiety disorder and depression? Because I think they are also used oftentimes commonly together. And I do believe that they are in fact fairly different, are they not?
They are, and thank you for that question. And I'll say briefly too that I love your point about this this concern about where mental health is going is also an opportunity. And that, so when I feel anxiety about that future, what I lean in on is that mindset. What you really just, mindset shift. When we shift our mindset about what this means, both in terms of the mental health crisis that we're facing, how we think about anxiety in our lives, that is honestly, that is the absolute linchpin and what I think is the way forward. I think that mindset is a key. So, and to turn to your question about especially how anxiety is different from anxiety disorders, that is really also about the effect of our mindset about anxiety. So anxiety is a human emotion. All of us have it. It's not going anywhere. There's no way, which is, also why the medical model doesn't work, because we can't eradicate anxiety. It's nothing to get rid of, right? And it's on a spectrum. So it's not a light switch on and off. It's more like a dimmer switch, right? So it's this spectrum that we're all on that can be anything from just, that tummy test, what we say, that gut instinct, the butterflies in your stomach, that something's not quite right. It could be also a positive feeling, that it's excitement, right? And then all the way, honestly, to panic and to feeling that it's so overwhelming that it can be debilitating. So that is all, but that's still all normal anxiety. When you have an anxiety disorder is when the way that you cope with that full spectrum, the challenge of anxiety, the way you cope with it is causing functional impairment in your life. So for example, if I have social anxiety, which is at its core the fear of negative evaluation from others, then I would never really want to go on a podcast to speak to someone. I wouldn't want to, it might be very challenging to give lectures and public speeches, which is something I do often. And now I actually do feel nervous every time before a podcast or before I give a public speech. But the way I cope with that is, number one, I do a mindset shift. I think about, okay, this is me preparing to do my best. It means I care. I lean in on those parts. But if I instead started coping by never doing those podcasts, by deciding that I can't be a lecturer anymore, if I lost my job because of that, or if I wasn't able to, connect to my broader social community because I stopped going to events, I don't go to my kids' school play, that would start to be functional impairment, which is getting in the way of living and loving and being a productive member of society. And then that's when you might be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. So I can be anxious every day of my life, and even strongly anxious, and still not be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder if I'm able to work through that anxiety.
What role do early childhood or personal experience play in that regard? Because it can be that the first time you use your level of anxiety as a motivating factor, you go on that stage, or maybe as a kid you don't go into the podcast, but you do something that you're fairly anxious about and it goes super well. So you are learning that you're being rewarded with excitement, with positive emotions, with positive feelings and so forth. But let's say it doesn't go that well, and the first personal experience where you used your anxious feeling as a motivating factor have the opposite effect. So to which regard do those personal experiences, which we cannot really control, but which happen to us to a certain extent, play into that?
Those personal experiences are really crucial. What's also crucial is that we do come into the world with temperamental differences. So my older child has always been a little more anxious than my younger child temperamentally, and shows it in different ways. So one thing that, and when we think about it as this mix of, it's sort of the nature nurture, in its most simplistic form, but instead when we think about it as sort of the fit that we have, that we bring things to the world when we're born, each day we're learning, things are affecting that temperamental tendency, and we're learning and growing in their skills. So if we think about our child was born anxious, if we think about that as a bad thing, what we might start doing is over accommodating that sort of discomfort that the child feels. And so maybe we'll start to, even unconsciously or inadvertently, we'll start to buffer them. We'll say, you don't have to, don't, if that's uncomfortable for you, don't try out for the school play. It's okay. And if we don't have this mindset of skill building, what we don't realize is that that's an opportunity cost for our child to build those skills. Because the only way out of anxiety, so to speak, is through. It's to learn how to listen to it when it's rising. It's to learn how to ride it like a wave. Like you have to learn how to swim it. You have to learn how to surf it. And then to learn that when it goes down, that's also giving you information. And to have that as a skill focus rather than, oh, you feel anxious, that's a danger signal and I better protect you. That is a profound and central difference in our mindset about anxiety that shapes every reaction we have to it. And the argument of my book, and I think this is probably very consistent with the mindset, approach, is that instead, when we take that discomfort of anxiety as an opportunity to push beyond our limits, right, to push our boundaries, rather than a sign that we have to, make our boundaries tighter, all sorts of things will become possible. Because first of all, mental health is not the absence of emotional discomfort. It's the ability to struggle through it. And nothing great ever happened in the comfort zone. Nothing really interesting, nothing that ever really expanded our possibilities happened when we're just sitting there comfortable.
No, absolutely. I fully do agree. And what I also really did like in preparing for the podcast and reading your articles and in your book is the correlation of anxiety and hope. And I think we can maybe talk to that a little bit. How does anxiety trigger hope, or how can we frame anxiety to actually create hope for ourselves, but also for society and for bigger shifts in society?
The first step to understanding how to find the hope in anxiety is to really start by just listening to it, to take it not as a danger signal to avoid or suppress, which always makes it worse, but to take it as information about what we want in the future, what we care about. And so when you are open to that possibility, all of a sudden you see that future, which can be scary because it's uncertain, it's also full of possibilities. It hasn't shut down for you because you're only anxious when you're in it to win it. You think that a positive outcome is still possible, because otherwise you would be despairing about the future. Anxiety tells us that we still have reason to hope. And so when we listen to it, and we see that, that bad thing hasn't happened yet, I'm waiting to get those medical tests back, right? Or I'm waiting to, and I tell a story in the book about how my son was born with a congenital heart condition that I knew would require open heart surgery when he was 4 months old, or an infant. And, I was extremely anxious about that, obviously, but I wasn't despairing because I knew that he could die. But I also knew if we worked to get him the right treatment, he could survive and thrive. So that is where anxiety sets us in our life. It sets us to move into the world of possibilities and creativity, innovation, thinking outside the box to get that thing you want and avert disaster.
And I'm just thinking out loud, is there particular mindset shifts or tools or techniques that also less experienced people with anxiety could follow in order to first understand that anxiety levels are rising, and then also to use it for their own motivation, for their own decision-making processes? I don't know, does anything come to mind?
Yeah, I was realizing I really need to create those resources, but they do exist. A lot of it has existed in the research literature up till now. And I think people really are, mindset interventions are nudge interventions, which are really, when we think about the future of mental health, and as you were articulating, there's opportunity here, there's possibility. I think it's these nudge brief interventions. By definition, these are things that are brief, but also that are sort of pivotal, that have a very powerful, exponentially powerful impact, because they're targeting something that's a linchpin in a problem and a solution. So when it comes to mindsets, our mindset about anxiety is a very simple practice in many ways. So, and I'll cite some research to illustrate this, research that's continued and has been replicated and is starting to get out there. So out of Harvard, Jameson and colleagues, I think it was back in 2013, they published a seminal study in which they had people who were socially anxious, who had social anxiety disorder, do a mindset shift as they were about to embark upon something that was an extremely anxiety-provoking situation for them, which was to give a public speech impromptu with very little preparation. Someone who's socially anxious it's like that's kryptonite for them, right? They're terrified of that social judgment. And they were about to give a speech in just a few minutes in front of a panel of judges who already, we're like, we're already looking very judgmental and negative. But half of those people were given a mindset intervention. And what they were taught was they were said, listen, you're going to feel these anxious thoughts and feelings. It's going to feel bad. Your heart's going to race. Here's what you can anticipate. But that is actually, here's some biological evidence to show that that's actually not your body preparing to panic and fail. It's actually your body preparing for you to succeed. So your heart is racing because it's pumping oxygen to your brain. Your fight flight system, it's kind of activating, but mostly because it needs to rise to the occasion. And so you don't need to panic about that. And this is something that humans have evolved to do. And here's some research in evolutionary theory to show you that. So essentially, for about 15 to 30 minutes, people were just taught to shift their mindset slightly, to consider the possibility that anxiety was an ally, one that you need to negotiate with, like most allies, but an ally in that moment to them. The other half of the folks were not given that information. And what do you know? When they actually went and did the speech and were not only, they were monitored their heart rate and their blood pressure, they were also judged on the quality of their speech. The people who had the mindset shift, they performed better. They had fewer stutters, ums, ahs, they showed more confidence. They also had lower blood pressure and lower heart rate. So this sort of cardiovascular profile that was about really primed to perform rather than primed to panic. Whereas the other half of the folks, they were much more in this panic mode and did more poorly. So that was a 15-minute exercise. This is something that in some form or the other, we can do every day. As we anticipate things that we're going into, as we're thrown into the deep end of a situation, we can take a moment, listen to our anxiety, reframe it as a potential ally, and gain skills in working with that ally and taking the best. And, sometimes it's not useful and we can learn ways to cope with that. And certainly anxiety disorders, I'm not just saying to people suffering from anxiety disorders, oh, just shift your mindset and everything changes. But even with anxiety disorders, a mindset shift will help profoundly if it's practiced over time. And it will help you do all that other really hard, messy work of being human that you have to do when you're struggling with an anxiety disorder.
And from an anxiety disorder, as you said, I do agree that we cannot just shift the mindset and everything will be fine. There's more work to do than that. But if we go even a step further from an anxiety disorder into depression, what should we know about that?
It's interesting. When I wrote this book about anxiety, I really struggled with whether that should be my starting point because I sort of want to talk about all the emotions. I want to rescue all the painful, difficult emotions to help us shift our mindset about them in a way. It's like there's been bad PR about anxiety and sadness and anger and all it was. So not to just equate me with being a publicist for anxiety or sadness. And I didn't start with depressed mood or anxiety or sadness, right? The emotional experience, because I myself struggled with clinical anxiety when I was a teenager. And I think it was too hard for me in a way to do that, to really, and also I think the science is less strong around this area. But let me say this about depression. So depression and anxiety as disorder, so a major depressive disorder, which is not the same as depressed mood, right? And anxiety disorders are highly comorbid, meaning they co-occur often, about 50% of the time, upward, even upwards of that. And so there are experiences that we have. So functionally, we experience depression at this, often it's triggered by a deep loss. Anxiety disorders are about you're anticipating threat in the future and you get stuck, in the future, right? And you get stuck on this avoidance cycle. You're not, you just avoid rather than coping with it in more productive ways. You tend to focus too much on threat and lose flexibility in seeing the positive. So that's sort of anxiety. It's this future. But with depression and major depressive disorder in particular, you've had a loss of something that you really value. Sometimes it's a traumatic loss. Other times it's a loss of something that's really blocked your ability to have hope for the future and to see possibility in the future. Even when you suffer with an anxiety disorder, you still see possibility in the future. You're trying to control it. But with a major depressive disorder, you've lost that faith. You're despairing. And you also tend to go more back to the past. So in a sense, I guess if I wrote a book about depression, that would be, maybe it would be called past tense. I don't know, but there is this, and what that's referring to is something we've all experienced on some level, which is rumination. This repetitive negative thinking about something that happened. I did that, I messed that up. That's, that tends to be much more present in, not that it's absent in someone who's struggling with an anxiety disorder, but it's much more present in a major depressive experience. And even when we're feeling depressed moods. So, for me, I don't struggle so much with depression on a day-to-day basis, but what I do see as my vulnerability in life is that I really am a hopeful person. And if life really throws you a lot of curveballs and you start to lose that ability to see possible futures, to see that we have efficacy and autonomy in our lives. If that's either we cease to believe it or we can't find it. And indeed, sometimes people really are stymied in that. So many of us are so privileged to have that. And so many of us have real obstacles to that. If we can't find that in our lives, that is what can predispose us not only to a major depressive experience, but also to people who are suicidal and self-harming. It's that despair. It's that loss of possibilities. So you can see how there's, and that can flip into anxiety sometimes when, I don't really see possibilities, but I do see the future and it's very scary. So you can see how that can happen. But there are these kind of existentially, these different kinds of experiences as well.
Now, obviously, the past can certainly impact our thoughts on the future and therefore trigger anxiety. And thanks for that elaboration. I think that helped a lot to understand depression, anxiety, and anxiety tendencies. And if you say that this is one of the vulnerabilities of your life, is there certain tips or techniques that you tell people or that you tell people you work with that they can and should follow? I believe that usually acknowledgement is one of the first steps if you have something, but what is there to follow if there is some general advice that you can give?
There is, and there are a million. I want to say too, as much as I sort of rail against the mental health industrial complex, which includes self-help, which includes all these wellness, and some are amazing, all these science-based wellness practices. As much as I rail against them, there are great tools there. So what's the problem? What's this mystery, right? Because we have great solutions. But where I come in giving kind of thoughts on advice is that we need to take a step back, and it is a mindset shift, and instead have broad principles that allow us to benefit from those great solutions out there. And as you say, the very first step in those, and I have 3 broad principles. Maybe it was because I was raised Catholic. I don't know. I think in threes constantly. But the very first principle is, as you say, to really be aware of and listen to
Awareness.
the whole spectrum of difficult feelings. Because again, I can't say it strongly enough. Mental health is not the absence of emotional discomfort. We should aspire to much more than being comfortably numb. And the problem with where we are right now is that there's a lot of suffering, there's a lot of challenge, and we think we're just going to numb it out of existence. We're going to avoid it out of existence. We're going to drug it out of existence, and that just doesn't work. So the first step is acknowledge, engage, and know that you're not broken if you experience this. This is human. This is the messy work of being human. We do hard things. We have to do hard things to actually thrive. So listen, see if there's information there. So in anxiety, it's very, in the book, I really outline, like, here's the types of information it can give you, what you care about, what your future holds, what you want, what the possibilities are, how to be more creative and innovative. You can hear that in anxiety when you give it a chance and stop pathologizing yourself when you experience it and knowing you can tolerate it. It's not dangerous. Emotions are not dangerous. The only thing that's dangerous is how we cope with them. So that's step 1, listen. Step 2 is have enough flexibility to know that sometimes you just can't white knuckle it through. Sometimes anxiety, sadness, anger is not giving you useful information, or you're not in a good place. It's just too much. And all of us get to that point. And so those are the times when, with wisdom, with self-knowledge and skills, much like fitness, right? Like, you can build endurance. You have to practice. So those are the moments when it comes to anxiety, especially, leave the future tense. If you're stuck in it with worries and, angst and all those things for anxiety, come back to the present. And that's where we find a lot of nourishment. That's where we find human connection, creativity. I love to do yoga. So yoga is something that brings me back. Exercise is one of the best panaceas out there.
Absolutely.
Getting, right? And psychologically and physically. I love to write poetry because it makes me think completely differently than I do as a scientist and as a writer. So, and it's, it's mostly bad poetry, but sometimes it's good and it's wonderful, and I love that. But you as an individual, one has to build those skills and empowerment to know that you can do things to cope in the moment. And listen, sometimes you might want to binge your streaming service a little bit. You might want to watch 5 Netflix shows in a row or whatever it is. Fine. Give yourself a little grace. Sometimes I just go take a nap. I'm just like, I gotta, but know that you have to be, it's like alchemy. It's like emotional alchemy. You have to work with these emotions and bring different ones to the fore. Ride a wave, learn to surf it, learn to swim first, but then you'll learn to surf. But then the third step, and this is really important to me, and I'll speak from personal experience too, as someone who did struggle with major depressive disorder, is that once we kind of get ourselves to a stable place through either wellness or therapy or whatever it is, then we need to hitch those difficult emotions like anxiety to a sense of purpose. So we need to use this energizing emotion of anxiety that makes us hope and work for the future. Find something that is greater than yourself, that gives you joy, purpose, meaning, and use that energy to pursue it. And it's what the crisis I see right now for so many of us. There's so much that's hard and wrong and difficult. But I think the real crisis is that we have a crisis of purpose, and we are not helping our kids as much as we should identify purpose, because right now we're hyper consumerized, we're hyper branded in everything we do. I mean, kids are growing up on social media. I don't think it's all good or all bad, but a core problem with social media, besides just being these massive escape machines and doom scrolling, amplifiers of negativity, is that it makes us believe that we're brands to sell. It makes kids believe that their value is in how many clicks they get. And it incentivizes us and gamifies us to live at the most shallow level, not a level of nuance and richness and purpose. And so for me, I think that's what that is very messy work of being human, because that's hard. Like, how do we find purpose? Something that, it doesn't have to be big, but how do we find it? How do we help our kids? How do we stop equating success with just the amount of things we consume, or the amount that we are consumed as some sort of product? That's the task that I see we all have ahead of ourselves.
No, absolutely. I fully agree. And I would like to talk a little bit about technology in a bit. But I think what you just raised as a topic is the purpose topic. And I think that's a super interesting one. And I would be very interested, Tracy, to hear from you. How did you or how do you find your own very purpose? And how do you, to make it tangible, help your children, as an example, to find their purpose or to make it more interesting and important to find their purpose?
That's a great question. For me, in finding purpose, I've been, I think I've been very blessed um, to not put myself in one mold. So I actually
Mm-hmm.
started my life as my professional and like serious life as a classical oboist of all things. So from the time I was a kid, I was very interested in the arts and music. I went to a school of the arts. I went to conservatory to study classical music at the Eastman School of Music. I
Mm-hmm.
planned to become an orchestral oboist. A lot of people may not even know what that instrument is. That's how obtuse it is. But in the middle of my undergraduate conservatory training, I fell in love with psychology. I started working with kids um, in a research center where they studied resilience and trauma and how
Uh-huh.
do kids survive and thrive incredible trauma. And it just woke me up to this, that I wanted to get up every morning and do that. And so I made this very difficult decision that I'd spent all my life up since I was 9 years old, just training to be a
Mm-hmm.
musician. And I said, this is what I want to do. So I think one thing about finding purpose is not putting yourself in a box. I think young people
Mm-hmm.
today are better at that. Although sometimes to a fault, because you're like, "Ooh, this is hard. Let's jump to this other thing." But that flexibility is good. So I think flexibility and knowing that when you shut down one path, others open. So knowing that there, even in this very, very difficult world right now, there are still always possibilities. So that's one thing. I think knowing that it's valuable to wake up every morning and have a passion. And, again, that's a
Mm-hmm.
luxury because then I became an academic. So I was able to get up every morning and think about what I wanted to think about and create. I think I channeled all that creativity into the incredibly creative field of doing science. So I already had this sort of sense of my own creativity and empowerment there, and I was able to channel it and think outside the box and really work hard and do all those things. So there is, and it's a little easy to say find your passion, because sometimes don't worry about finding the passion, but find something that you wake up every morning thinking about and follow that breadcrumb trail. And so with my
Mm-hmm.
kids, I'm very interested to see where that breadcrumb trail is going to take them. And
Indeed.
so what I try to do as a parent and my husband, as partners in that, is we pay attention to our kids. What lights them up? Where do they find flow? And that's even a better word than passion, I think, because flow is when your skills are matched well with the challenge, but you're challenged. It's not too easy, it's not too hard. And when you find that challenge where you push yourself past your boundaries just enough, you lose track of time, you're immersed in the moment. That's a good indicator of a good
Absolutely.
purpose to pursue. So we observe, we're like, ooh, what's leading our kids to find a sense of flow? And we just follow that lead. And we give them whatever resources we're able to and whatever encouragement we're able to push, to push those resources forward in front of them and encourage them.
Mm.
And sometimes there's been a couple times when I took the lead a little bit because they're like, I don't want to, have a guitar lesson. And I was like, honey, just try it for a month. Give me a month. And this was my daughter, actually, just a few months ago. Give it a month and just see. She's like, okay. And once she realized she could turn up the distortion on the electric guitar and she loves to write lyrics to songs. She's like, oh, Mom, I'm glad you pushed me on that one a little bit. So, but you have to be flexible. You have to be paying attention and just be an observer of yourself
Mm.
and of your loved ones around you.
Mm. So I hear that you should experiment yourself and that you should also encourage others to experiment, right? And give it a try for a week. Be curious for the uncertainty, let's call it, where anxiety comes back in.
I was talking to this wonderful young woman who I've been collaborating with on some digital wellness initiatives.
Mm-hmm.
Her name is Anastasia Vlasova, and she has done a lot of advocacy. I mean, I don't know, she's barely 20 years old. She's this amazing young woman. And she is doing a lot of advocacy for her peers, about how do we navigate our social media lives? How, how do we become digital citizens, essentially, is what she's working on. And she was, really looking at her peers and also some of their emotional struggles, which are so salient now for so many young people. And she said, and this is what you said about uncertainty really made me think of this. She said, really what it is that we see this incredible uncertainty that, the world has handed us, a lot of it out of our control. And we can't see the possibility in it. And we feel that we're constantly on edge. We're just constantly like vulnerable. And she said, what changed for me, she was saying, and what she realized is that I can get knocked down. I can have these uncertain things happen, but I can't be shaken. Who I actually am as a person, to realize this at 20 is remarkable, but she's like, who I am cannot be shaken, even if bad things around me happen, even if I emotionally lose it. And that sort of, and that's about openness to possibility. It's about curiosity about your inner world. It's about that openness. And I just was in such admiration and respect for that stance. And I think if we can help other people get there, other young people especially, but any of us, that is an incredibly powerful way to handle this uncertain world that we have in front of us.
No, absolutely. That's super remarkable. And thanks for sharing that story. That sounds very inspiring and very interesting. And I do believe, as you say, that there is good opportunity that we are actually tapping into that uncertainty and that we are actually making it something to live with, because we're always going to live with in uncertainty, but that we also appreciate such and come up with new inventions, come up with new developments, and come up with new ideas. And I would like to use that as a little segue, because we've talked about it a few times, technology and anxiety. And I think there's two sides of it. I think there is the fairly negative, or people talk negatively about social media and anxiety, but then it's also, for me, a big opportunity, right? If you talk about your broad principles, I think technology, having a podcast, having the ability to reach all corners of this world with publishing a book, also helps us to advocate the right things with technology. So maybe we could talk about those two sides of the coin and discuss a little bit, what role does technology play in regard to anxiety, but also in regard to mental health of our societies?
Yeah, it's so funny. Our attitudes about social media and technology have been very shaped by technology, because it's very binary. So we've learned, we've been sort of corralled into thinking about things in much more black and white terms. We've been polarized. And that's the world that's the binary world. And that's the world that technology companies purposefully built. They didn't have to build it that way. But again, we're incentivized to be part of the outrage machine, right? This binary approach to the role of technology in humanity and our lives, I think, is really doomed to fail, because if you either say technology has destroyed us, or there's nothing wrong with technology, you're actually not going to come up with any useful solutions, because of course it's this messy middle, it's this nuance. It's where I love to live, but the rest of the world doesn't seem to love it. But that's where I think that's where we'll be saved, because the thing about technology, especially as we think about kids and young people, is, and I know this as a parent, you're always, and for ourselves really too, you're always kind of struggling with, should I just completely get off screens? Is it like toxic, like poison? But really, it's not going anywhere, as just like uncertainty. And we have to learn and teach our kids to be digital citizens. What does that mean? We have to think about rights and responsibilities, and we have to in a very clear-eyed way, see that we've been handed a very toxic, negative ecosystem that these corporations have built for their bottom line and not for our well-being, despite the early, I remember, 10, 12 years ago when we thought all those Silicon Valley billionaires were these like, black turtlenecked little saviors who were going to make it,
Saints.
who were just saints. They were saints that are going to make our lives better. And really the opposite is probably true in most cases, but because it's all, but we have to educate ourselves about the nature. We have to take action when we can. And we also have to take societal wide action, but we also have to take personal action and responsibility to say, hey, if we know this, what are the ways that I can use technology that are not, that make me feel good, that help me create something great, that is not an opportunity cost with my IRL goals. So for example, when I think about my kids on screens, I allow them to be on. We monitor the time, we monitor what they're doing, but most importantly, we make sure it's not an opportunity cost for, my daughter to learn the guitar, my son to go running on his track team, and also he's a musician as well, to compose his new jazz piece that he's really interested in. If it's an opportunity cost, then it's a problem. If it's keeping them from doing those things. So, then you do it for your kids in the beginning, and then you scaffold their ability to do it for themselves. So again, it's this skill building, it's this citizenship model that I think is actually the most helpful approach and helps us come up with the most tenable solutions. And that's part of it. Now, you asked about anxiety and technology. I've really pushed up against this idea that technology causes anxiety, and that's why, it's destroyed a generation, and that's why they're suicidal and anxious and depressed, all these young kids. I don't think that's the case. I do think that technology can amplify all of those problems. It's more of an amplifier than a simple unidirectional causal arrow. And one of the reasons it's particularly difficult or problematic for anxiety is because technology is this giant escape machine. It's right. And when we avoid anxiety, that's a recipe for making it worse. And it's an opportunity cost in terms of learning how to cope with it and seeing the benefits potentially of dealing with those difficult feelings and working through. So if you can just start doom scrolling instead of actually listening to your anxiety, if you can, get lost on Instagram, if you can, I guess kids get more lost on TikTok these days. If, that is an escape mechanism that we have to be very aware of. So if we see our kids doing that, again, it's not so much, are they on TikTok and how much are they and what are they doing? It's that, but it's also, are they only on TikTok after they've had a big fight with their best friend? And are they staying up at night doing it? And are they clearly using this in a way that's contributing probably to growing their anxiety even bigger? So those are the ways. I think if we just take this slightly different perspective, we'll be able to pinpoint when it's a problem, how to change our habits, and how to build better ones.
And educate our children and other people of society how to deal with social media. I'm not saying it's always bad or it's always good, but there are ways to use it, and there are ways that you may or may not use it yourself. And what you just said, this escape mechanism, triggered another thought in myself. And we earlier said that you will never ever get rid of anxiety because it's just a human emotion. And we just said that social media and technology can be one of the big escape mechanisms. And I believe that there is another big escape mechanism, which is built on the school of thought that we created over the past 50, 60 years. And that is medication for anxiety and such. I don't know if you have a few words to say about that.
Yeah, no, I have a lot of words, but I will keep it brief. So I think actually that this medical model of mental illness has clearly driven both, I would say both practically and spiritually and existentially, the crisis that we have, not only with some very dangerous medications for anxiety like benzodiazepines, but also the opioid crisis. Because it's this idea that what we need to aspire to is to be comfortably numb, and both emotionally and physically. And we have this huge industry, the pharmaceutical industry, that has very few compunctions in many cases to thinking about the long-term implications of these, in many cases, highly addictive, highly dangerous medications. Now, I do want to say that I don't think all benzodiazepines are bad, as you might already guess about me, that I don't think in black and white terms in that way. But I think we're using them incorrectly. And I think it's on us, mental health professionals, and particularly psychiatry, which is the medical, the medical field, to really educate people and to not overprescribe in a radically different way. Right now, so if you have an anxiety disorder, the best research out there suggests that benzodiazepines can help you. But the way that they are meant to help you is to be used for a short period of time, and even more effectively if it's in combination with a behavioral and cognitive therapeutic approach like cognitive behavioral therapy, which has excellent evidence behind it, particularly for anxiety disorders. So if you are really struggling with anxiety, you've been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, you need to build new ways of coping. Sometimes taking a benzodiazepine will bring you back to a baseline so that your physical experience and emotional experience is not overwhelming. And then you can benefit through things like therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, to building, you can actually build those new skills. So in those use cases, I would never say to someone, don't take a benzodiazepine. But what I would say to them is take it carefully, know that it's highly addictive, know that it's the third leading cause of overdose deaths in the United States, the third behind opioids. And so know that the longer you take it, that often there's a rebound effect and the more anxious you'll feel over time. And that is what and then I'd say to our profession, we have to do a much better job of being very careful and educating very carefully with the use of benzodiazepines. And we can't just diagnose them for someone who comes and says, I'm having problems sleeping. Oh, here, take a benzodiazepine. Or you can have this culture where we pop a Xanax every time we're a little nervous about something, because that's exactly the way you can block yourself from learning to work through anxiety. It's going around anxiety rather than through. So if we again can be flexible and say, sometimes we might need a medication to help. It should be temporary. It should be helping us build other skills that we can have for a lifetime. Then we can have those conversations. But right now we're doing it completely wrong. And we're doing it in a destructive way that are killing people, especially young people.
Because partially it's even praised in pop culture and in how we actually deal with the whole fact. And I don't know if there is any data or any numbers, or if you can comment on that, but if you say we have to use an approach that's much more educational and to educate the users or the clients of such things, what do you think would be the percentage, if you can give any numbers, that we actually use this medication right and not wrong?
Oh, I don't know. I know that there's a very different problem in the US versus Europe and other parts of the world, because in the US, we've seen the prescription of benzodiazepines increase, skyrocket, so that we have tens and tens of millions of prescriptions out there.
Yeah.
And we saw this with the opioid crisis as well, where there was one point, I think the stats are something like, at one point in the United States, there were enough circulating opioids for every man, woman, and child and person in the United States, like several times over. And it was something like tens of times greater than the presence of opioids in other parts of the world. And I think we're in a similar situation with benzodiazepines, not that extreme, but that's where, again, it's this culture of being comfortably numb. It doesn't work for opioids and it doesn't work for benzodiazepines. And so that culture and our mindset about that needs to shift.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you very much for sharing those insights. And I would like to shift gears a little bit and talk about ways or techniques, as in how, we can turn our anxiety into energy that benefits you and I personally, but also professionally. I don't know if you have some words to that.
Yeah, I think one thing is, what anxiety helps us do is, it's sort of like, I was talking to someone the other day and he was saying, when I was in college, and he's my age, he's a Gen Xer like I am. It's like, when I was in college, it was exam time, or it was just before exam time, and I'd wake up in the middle of the night, I'd be worrying about that test. And I took it actually as I realized I didn't study enough and the test was 3 days away. So I would get up in the middle of the night and I'd go study, and then my anxiety would go down. And I'd be like, okay, that was it. And if I had reached out to my mom, he's saying, and I said, oh, Mom, I'm really anxious about the test. If she had said, oh, honey, don't worry, just go back to sleep, Like that probably wouldn't have been. Now, that's not to say we should just white knuckle it through, run on anxiety, rely on anxiety to do everything in our life. But what it does is it does send us into this future where we see, okay, I'm worried about this job interview I'm doing tomorrow. I'm anxious about it because I could bomb it or I could crush it. So I'm anxious about it because I think I need to prepare a little more. So I'm going to sit and I'm going to prepare. And so, but then what you need to do is you need to break that down. So, and I was talking to someone who actually really thinks about corporate context and being a manager and helping people work through anxiety. It's like, so if you have an employee who's so anxious about everything and they're overwhelmed and they're starting to like take sick days and not do their stuff and just avoid, you need to like lean right into that and say, okay, and really be a support to them and help them do it for themselves. Okay, what is this big thing that's causing me anxiety? Oh, well, the deadline is really, it was a bad deadline. It was probably 2 weeks too soon. And it's going to be a real struggle. Okay, so how do we break that problem down into actionables? So we need to put more people on it. We need to try to push that deadline one more week. So all of a sudden, that anxiety, when you wrangle it, when you negotiate with this ally, you break it down into actionables. And so right. And so that's one big key, I think, to using anxiety in a productive way. The second is to know that anxiety should not be an isolating feeling. It's one because it does prime us to reach out to others, sometimes in helpful ways and sometimes not. We can be too reassurance seeking. We can get too in that. But if we can take it and practice as it primes us to reach out, when I'm really anxious about something, I always talk to my husband. I talk to my best friends. I reach out to people, my sister, my mom, people who I know are big supports to me. And it always makes it better. I choose those people probably wisely because I know some people are better in certain, but that I think a second step to using anxiety productively is knowing you're not alone and seeking that social support. And really our brains do to outsource stress to other people. There's great studies in neuroscience showing that if you're facing something like a painful shock and your brain's being imaged and you're about to be shocked, with an electric shocker, and you hold someone's hand, the circuitry in your brain that's sort of the threat system that anxiety often really overactivates if it's overwhelming, just by holding someone's hand versus not, it calms the anxious brain. It's as if you're outsourcing that challenge and other people's brains are doing the work for you. So that's a really powerful way, again, to use anxiety productively and to figure that out. Anxiety also helps us persist. It helps us pursue excellence. So I talk in the book about this concept of excellencism in contrast to perfectionism. Perfectionism is never good because it's this toxic standard of flawlessness. It's all or nothing, right? And you can never really get there, right? So you're always going to fail. That's well. And it leads to the law of diminishing returns because you never know when it's good enough and you probably do too much and sometimes, put too much effort in and don't have the same return. And it's shown that people who are perfectionistic have higher anxiety, higher depression, and less quality products. Excellencism is the belief that it's something that Thomas Edison said, actually. He was a perfect excellencist, the inventor. He said, I haven't failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that don't work yet. And so that's what excellencism is. It's knowing that you have to fail along the way to excellence, to knowing that sometimes it's just good enough. It doesn't have to be perfect. And anxiety actually primes us to be more excellencists. So people who are good excellencists tend to be higher on anxiety scales than people who aren't. So we can pursue excellence, we can persist, we can be innovative. Anxiety is prepared to be our helpmate in all of those things.
No, absolutely. I love it. And I love that failure or that attempts will be part of the way finding excellence. And I also really like that understanding that collectivism may help us. I think we've used the past 100 years at least to build societies that are super individualistic. And now we understand that helping each other, being each other's helping hands, can really, benefit all of us, not only in small communities, but also as a society all over the world, right? And across borders.
Maybe that's our greatest superpower, honestly.
Absolutely, absolutely. Tracy, thank you so much. I have 3 questions that I ask each and every of my podcast guests. But before we go there, I'm very sure that our audience would like to reach out, get to know more about you. I'm sure that they can go ahead and find your book. I'm obviously gonna link all that to the speaker notes, but where can people find you? How can people engage with you?
You can check out my website, drtracyphd.com. That's a hub for all things future tense and my work as well, including some of my academic research if people are so inclined. You can buy the book at all the ways that people do. Also, I encourage you to go to your local bookstore and see if they don't have it on the shelf, see if they can order it. And I am on social media. I'm trying to use it as a wise digital citizen. Only really I'm also on LinkedIn. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm also the co-founder of a digital therapeutics company, which is I didn't even go there, called Wise Therapeutics. So I'm on LinkedIn. And on Twitter, I'm Tracy A. Dennis. And on Instagram, where I try to share a lot of my book content in particular, it's Dr. Tracy, PhD.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. And I think it's always good to have some content for a round two, because this has been very fun and exciting. So I'm sure we can look at different topics with that, Tracy. And that leads me to 3 final questions that I have for my podcast guests. And the first one would be, what influenced and motivated you over the past week?
I would say my children actually motivated me over the past week. They were both at sleepaway camp and just came back. So I had this kind of beautiful and challenging experience of having been just me and my husband for the first time in a long time. They're 10 and 13. And then having them back and thinking about how we as human beings, and as a parent, it's all about fit, right? It's how do we fit each other in ways that are the most loving, the most supportive, good boundaries too, but also encouraging. So that was sort of what motivated me a lot today to try on that fit again and to see my children growing up really beautifully. That was kind of, they're at that age. That's very exciting.
Wonderful. I love it. Yeah, it's a good energy they spread, I can imagine. So thanks for that answer. And the second question would be, whom are your mentors and whom do you look up to?
Oh, so many people. I think I think I was thinking about who can I focus on for this. I'd say one of my best mentors, this might sound a little cheesy, and maybe it's and maybe it's that I'm sort of we're all like in an office together all the time. But my husband in our home office, he has been an incredible mentor to me in terms of shifting from being a pretty insular academic, like just loving being in my research lab, head down, a schlubby academic. He's in the entertainment industry and he knows about communicating and getting the word out. And so I think he's been such a support and mentor in terms of how do I make that transition from, it's sort of my third act in life, because first I was a musician, then a scientist. And now it's really about how do I start a society-wide, worldwide conversation about how we need new mindsets about mental health and anxiety in particular. And so I guess I have to say that he's a really important mentor to me.
Absolutely. And I must say he has done a very tremendous job as you are communicating very nicely and very fluently. So
He might be surprised that I just said that. He's not here right now.
But... Wonderful. I love that answer, Tracy. And for the third question, that's a rather hypothetical one. I call it the 3 truths. And Tracy, I would love you to imagine that you are traveling all by yourself in space. And actually, you're traveling there for quite some time, for some months, or maybe even for a few years. And after a long time, you actually encounter a human-like species. And they can only process 3 facts or 3 truths about humanity before they decide whether or not they want to get to know us. What is it that you tell them?
I love that you are probably a sci-fi nerd like I am. So I love this question. And I love these sci-fi questions because honestly, science fiction is the genre of anxiety, because it's about all these future possibilities. So what I think that three key facts about humanity is that we are social animals, that we, as we spoke about earlier, we draw our strength from others. I think the second fact I might say is that we that strength is also one of our greatest weaknesses, because we can be tribal in ways that give us strength, and we are tribal in ways that destroy. And the third is that I think I would focus on the central role of, what we talked about before is this talk about a triumph of human evolution, the fact that we evolved to imagine the future and to build what hasn't existed yet. And this again is our great double-edged sword, because we can imagine a world in which certain technologies change everything, and then don't imagine far enough to see how those changes have affected all beings on the planet. And we, being tribal, we're not very good at thinking about other beings on the planet in addition to ourselves. So it's this social nature, this double-edged sword, and this fundamental imaginative capacity that I guess would be really important to know about us.
Absolutely. And as so often, it's about the right balance of things, and positive and negative. Tracy, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. And if there is anything that you would like to share with the audience, which we didn't talk about sufficiently, feel free to do so now.
Oh, thank you. It's been so wonderful speaking with you. Really grateful to do it. I think I would just leave people with the idea that, what I alluded to it before, being human is messy. Feeling anxiety is not a failure. And we are not fragile. We can do hard things as humans. And I think we can reclaim that strength rather than believe that we're vulnerable and broken, that's the mindset we all need and is true.
Wonderful. Let's go for that mindset shift. Thank you so much, Tracy.
Thank you, Ismail. So great talking to you.
If you enjoy and learn from the Just Another Mindset podcast, please make sure to share this episode with a friend or two and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcast. And if you want to receive a brief overview of what made me think over the past week and join like-minded individuals, you may want to sign up to my weekly newsletter. It is easy to sign up. It is super easy to unsubscribe again. You will get information on the newest podcast episode, and you will also get an overview of the content, books, and podcasts mainly, that I am consuming, and I evaluate what I've learned over the past week. You will also get your weekly dose of optimism, because you will receive the Smile News with 7 things that went right this week. And finally, you will get access to all my speaker notes that you can use to follow exercises and answer questions discussed in the podcast. Just follow the link in my bio to sign up for my newsletter, and I'm already excited to see you on the other side. If there is any future topic or guest that you would like to hear more about on the Just Another Mindset podcast, please let me know by leaving a comment on YouTube or sending a mail directly to contact@ishmaelwondergarten.com. And if nobody told you lately, be reminded that you are worthy, you matter, and you can achieve anything.
Do more of what makes you happy.
Be yourself positive.
Change.
Just another mindset.